Welcome everybody to today's online lecture on engaging with complexity through intersectionality, the gendered power of public spaces. My name is Julia Scharinger. I'm a program manager here at the ASPR and have the pleasure of accompanying you throughout this series. This IPT online lecture series is part of the ASPR's wider campaign on Homeland Earth, Terre Patrie. As you can read in the manifesto on our website of this campaign, it's dedicated to the work of French philosopher and sociologist Edgar Morin. Already in the 90s, he wrote about the situation or the context of us living in a poly-crisis and called us to reimagine our awareness or our sense of identity and belonging, not only towards the communities or the nation state, but also towards the planet. You will also read in this manifesto that one aspect of this poly-crisis is interstate violence, specifically, for example, racism, classism, or sexism. It is this aspect into which we will dive deeper throughout this coming lecture, together with its impact on our experience of belonging. And to do so, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Gal Harmat. By taking us on a virtual tour throughout the world, she will show how public spaces can be designed to or to exclude, to represent or misrepresent, and what that means for navigating and belonging across different social fault lines. The tour will take about 20 minutes and will be put on YouTube, so please adjust your video settings accordingly. And then if you can, join us via video again afterwards to have a shared exchange, discussion and reflection on what you've just heard. Gal, you are actually a graduate of our previous European Peace University, and you are a regular trainer throughout the International Civilian Peacebuilding Training Program here. We've really missed your presence with us, and it's such a pleasure to have you back, at least virtually, with us. So thank you for joining. And before I hand over to you, I want to invite or call us into this space. Talking about multiple crises is a complex task, especially as we talk and as we come together as people from different gendered experience, from different spiritual or religious or cultural pathways, etc., etc. So we want to invite you, or I want to invite you into this space with care, with reflexivity, with curiosity and kindness, so that we, throughout this hour of connecting and conversing, reimagine and reproduce what it means to live in an inclusive, kind, and encouraging community. Thank you for being with us, and Gal, let's get started on this tour.
Thank you very much for inviting me for this kind introduction. I would like to explore with you in the next 20 minutes questions about belonging and complexity in changing realities, and ask what make us feel belong and who gets to feel a sense of belonging or representation in public spaces. I chose to concentrate on very positive examples from different parts of the world. I will try to map what I think is the problem, or what I will suggest is, according to my research, part of a problem, and then set ultra positive options and examples. Because I think that throughout the pandemic, a lot of social movement were able to take their agenda forward, and I would like to concentrate on that. So before we start, I would like to ask you, what is your street name? What sculptures or memorials are in your public space? What do they represent? Who's there and who's absent? What stories are told and what stories are hidden and are not told or ignored? I'm opening this with a slide of a health worker that was positioned in Latvia last August, in August 2020, to represent the care of health workers and to honor them. And we see a female health worker open her gloved cover arms, welcoming people inside the hospital, but also sending them away in health, reminding them to wear a mask and to keep themselves safe. And it's almost the antithesis of the way women going to be represented or was represented in the last 5,000 years. I'll concentrate in about a decade. And it's shifting. From August 2020 or June 2020, something incredible is happening, and I would like to show you and explore it together with you and claim that the world that we knew is transforming to be something completely different. And I think we have indicators of that in public space. So this is a sculpture in Florida. It's prior to 2020. It was positioned about 4 years ago, of a woman who opens her heart, and in her heart there is a garden, and it's an entrance to a little park and a pathway, and then a bridge, and then a botanic garden. And it captured the body and the road and what is Mother Earth, but what is also outside and inside of a person. This is another example, also from Florida, that represent a woman who is part of the earth, but also holding the earth. And I want to show you a little bit of what would consider a classic sculpture in public space, at least in parts of the world that I've worked in. This is Botero. This specific sculpture is in Colombia, and we see a woman who is lying there as a decorative object in the public space. Her nudity is there to entertain, but also to feel, to make us feel good about her and good about herself. She's reclaiming her fat, but in a way, her fat is decorating what's in our public space. And if we're looking at it as an educational text, we'll learn that women's body is there to decorate this space. We can see more or less the same positions, but in more sexually explicit pose in Prague, of a woman who is sitting there, and women who are lying naked. This is a sculpture by Dan Harrison that was positioned in Denmark in 2019, just before COVID. A woman lying on her back, covering her face. She's nameless. She doesn't have a body. She doesn't have any characteristics that are specific to her. She's just a body that decorates this space. If we're analyzing art, we see that already in 85, Guerrilla Girls posted graffitis and then flyers asking how many women artists are presented in modern art and in contemporary art museums. And they found out that less than 5% of the artists that presented in are women, and 85% of the nude are female. If you're going to your closest museum, whether it's a contemporary art or modern art or more traditional, you'll see that the number hasn't changed much in the last 35 years. This is my hometown museum, Tel Aviv. At the entrance of the Tel Aviv Art Museum, there is a Henry Moore from 1970, a woman lying, and she's spreading her legs. On my right, you can imagine the court, the district court, and she is she's on her back, lying on her hands. Do you see her breast standing? Her butt is positioned in a very sexual pose, and she doesn't have a name. She doesn't have feet, and she doesn't have a head. She's just a piece of meat, piece of a woman, and it's called female lying, a nude lying, and it's translated into a very interesting wording that is something between a female form and a woman, but she's not really a woman. She's just a piece of a female body. And I started.
Das habe ich im Detail gelesen, aber ich habe gesehen, es gibt jetzt eine Gender-Orientierungshilfe.
We hear you, so maybe you can mute your microphone. Thanks. Through my journey, I looked for positive representation and see how can we feel more comfortable in public space? Who is represented? What stories are told? And how can we bring more diversity into our public space? And Barbara Kruger said that the world is very small only if you don't have to clean it. And I tried in my research, also in my dream, to look at sculptures differently. And I started to count and analyze quantitatively and quantitatively how many sculptures of men fighting on a horse representing victory do we have in public spaces all over the world. And I started to count and I stopped because I thought that because the stories were similar. We had a man who conquered some place or colonized some people and was victorious, and he was positioned in a very heroic pose in a public space, never naked. Even if his body is exposed, his genitals are not spread and open to the public. And when I started to contrast this with what kind of other men do we have in public space, what stories are not told, I saw that in political art, in order to humiliate a man, and this is Netanyahu, there are many reasons to humiliate Netanyahu, but in order to criticize him or to show how weak he is, the artists who struggle against him are not representing him as a war criminal or a monger, as a corrupt person, as someone who violate human rights and disregard the law, but as a scared man who is naked and in the corner. So the way to represent his weakness, in the way to criticize him, is by showing him as if he's a woman in the public space. This is how women are represented in the public space: scared, naked, and in the corner, afraid, as if being afraid is a bad thing, is a negative thing. And coming from Israel, I'm not sure. I would like my prime minister to be a little bit more scared and considerate of other people, and take fear into account when deciding things. So men are represented naked only or mostly when they're humiliated or they're shamed. Women are naked just as a default because their role is to decorate a public space. And I said that it's going to be an optimistic talk and see how we feel comfortable. And I hope you're a little bit at least uncomfortable now, because I want to take us to a journey and highlight how life has changed in the last 2 years. This is Edward Colston. He was a colonialist. He trafficked people. He was a slave owner. He looted different countries in his journey to the old and the new world, from Africa to the United States and then back to Bristol. And in June 2020, a group of Black Lives Matter activists in the UK took his sculpture down and threw him to the river. And he paid for this sculpture to be there, to sit there in Bristol in a public space. He looked very smart, touching himself, of course, full clothing. And they took him down. And instead of his sculpture, they positioned a sculpture of Jane Reed. So Mark Quinn positioned a sculpture of Jane Reed. He sculptured her from a picture in a demonstration. She's standing there with black fist, with casual clothes, with her natural curly hair, and he just replaced it. The only thing he forgot to do while sculpturing this sculpture is to ask her permission, and she wasn't happy with people positioning her instead of Colston without her approval. And it started a debate: who's allowed to represent whom, whose story is to tell. Is Jane Reed's story is only hers, or is she, as a leader of Black Lives Matter, she's the leader of all of us? It's a question. But when I pass by and see Jane Reed as a sculpture, in a sculpture, I feel much more comfortable than Edward Colston. If we're looking at public space as an educational text, what we have to learn here is that women, or what I learned from this, is that women are represented in their power, in their struggle, although no one asked for their permission. It's better than Colston, but it's still not perfect. The interesting part in this whole scenario happened actually in London. When Colston sculpture was removed by Black Lives Matter, the London municipality and police surrounded Robert Milligan's sculpture with armed forces. And they protected the sculpture against people who wanted to loot it or to take it down. And when Colston was thrown to the river, they decided to take down the sculpture of Robert Milligan. And I would like to ask us, what do we do with Robert Milligan sculpture? Do we put him in a bad people museum and learn about colonialism? Do we melt it and make something else of it? What do we make of it? Do we make slaves freeing themselves? Do we put children playing on the beach? Do we put flowers? What would you like to see instead of Robert Milligan? Do we keep the sign of Robert Milligan telling his story? From which point of view? As a person who donated to the wealth of London, as a colonialist and a looter of Africa and Asia, as a sex and slave trafficker, or do we put him as a person who discovered countries in Africa? What stories do we tell, and how do we tell it? Would like to suggest a few examples. Razali was a slave in the Caribbean, and she dedicated her life throughout slavery. She was a house slave, and the person who thought owned her impregnated her by rape. And although she was pregnant, she went to the port and freed slaves. She burned ships, and before the slaves were brought to the shore, she cut their chains. She spread rumors about slavery in the Caribbean, and she freed them. And they helped her battle against the people who brought them from Africa. After Milligan and Colston sculptures were taken down in London and in Bristol, Paris positioned her in a park, the sculpture of Rosalee, and she's the first Black sculpture of a woman in Paris. In 2020, it's very hard to think about it, but it's true. And look at this sculpture, how powerful she is. The sculptures represent her pregnant, because she struggled while pregnant. She was sentenced to death by the person who thought is her owner, the trafficker, and he killed her 2 days after she gave birth to their joint child. And here she's in the most powerful position with her belly in her slave dress, with her natural hair, standing there in resistance. This is another sculpture of a woman who struggled against colonialism and slavery. It's in Copenhagen Port, and it's Mary Thompson. And the choice here is still keeping her with a slave dress, but on one hand, she has a torch burning the ships coming from Africa in order to symbolize how she tried and she did led slave rebellion. And on the other, she's holding an African royal symbol. She's covering her head. She's sitting as in a royal chair, but an African royal chair in Copenhagen, bringing the discussion of is colonialism be post-colonialism? Is it new colonialism? How do we tell this story? Who tells this story? Do we want her in a very dark bronze or do we want her in a lighter bronze? How would you like this place to be called? And at the same time, in the summer of 2020, an outcry of sculptures from the public sphere, or a lack of representation of women and women philosophers, women doctors, women whatever, were starting to bubble. People were sitting at home, and walking in the public sphere became a luxury. And suddenly people went in Central Park and in parks all over major cities in Europe and in the United States, in Australia, in New Zealand, definitely in Israel, and started to notice what is not there. And the person who wasn't there was Turcraft, who was a philosopher and a thinker, one of the first feminist thinkers in the world. And her sculpture here present her as what I consider a very small woman who's again naked. And the woman who sculptured that claimed that she wanted her to reclaim her sexuality, wanted her to feel comfortable around other people while naked, and bring her power and ability to change the world. But when I'm looking at this sculpture, what I see is a tiny, tiny woman on top of a fire or ash or something that's going on. I would like to ask a question: how would you like your favorite philosopher, your favorite theoretician to be represented? And with that, I would like us to look at Maya Angelou's square and ask questions about how would you like your square to be called? What do you want to see in it? What you definitely don't want to see in it, and how it should be represented. This is my favorite square, and soon I'll ask you about yours. This is Dunita Daneldson, who during the 80s got very angry on a group of neo-Nazis who walked in her town in Sweden, and she beat them up with her purse. And the municipality, it's a long story, and she committed suicide, probably not due to this incident, but she was a complex person. She suffered post-trauma, and the municipality decided to commemorate her. And the way she is commemorated, remembered, is by lifting her bag. But the neo-Nazis are not in the picture. They're already gone. And they're capturing the moment that she forced them to flee. And this is Fearless Girl in New York, presenting a little girl standing against the broker's absolute power and standing against capitalism, trying to bring a different approach to life. I see that my time is almost up, so I'm just gonna jump through different sculptures that was positioned in different parts of the world in the last few months, literally in the last 6 or 7 months, that start to represent and tell stories of other people who were not, who were silenced and ignored in sculptures in public spaces for centuries. And I would like to finish with the amazing exhibition in the Botanic Garden in New York, in Brooklyn, by Yaya Kusama, who brings into light femininity that deals with disability, with mental disabilities. She's embracing obsession and mental disabilities and putting it out there. She wants to wrap all the trees in the Botanic Garden in order to tell stories of people who are sick or disabled and have place in the public sphere, that they have an interesting story and need to be represented and feel safe and welcome and comfortable in the public sphere. And I will finish with that sculpture from both sides of this health worker who is welcome people into a hospital and outside of a hospital, commemorating the bravery of health workers, but also telling a totally different narrative of the naked woman who is there to decorate this space. She's a professional health worker who is saving us all. And I think we can start commemorating and telling the stories of those people in the public sphere and in other places. And that's for me right now.
Thank you, Gal. I really appreciated this tour, and it really reminded me that public spaces actually belong to the public, and as such we get to rewrite or reclaim public spaces, the names of streets, what kind of statues we want to see or don't want to see in our communal areas. And it really reminded me also about how stories are being written in such historic moments, like a country or a community coming out of a deep crisis, of a conflict, but also with social movements that lead us more towards social justice, towards transformations, such as the Black Lives Matter movement or also Me Too. And so it's been really, really interesting, and we would love to have everybody maybe just drop us a chat or drop us a line or a word or a phrase in the chat of where this lecture took you. And before we start or we engage with the discussion with everyone present, I want to say goodbye to those of you who've joined us via YouTube on a later stage in this historic time. So thank you for joining us or for re-watching this lecture as well. Before you also leave, I have a little bit of advertisement I would like to share with you, or an invitation, because if you want to think more about gender, we do have a short course, a free short course coming up at the IPT program that reflects more, or that invites you to engage more with the shift from women, peace and security to gender, peace and security. And if you catch this in time, we also have an intensive online masterclass coming up with Gal on gender, intersectionality and peace building in October and November 2021. But if you catch us on a later stage, feel free to check our website as well, because, as I said earlier, Gal is one of our regular trainers, and I'm sure there will be more opportunities to learn more from her and with her. And with that, thank you for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.